Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
I'm here with Teresa Ghilarducci. She is the professor of economics at the New School for Economic Research.
Yeah.
And you are a thought leader. A lot of folks on Wall Street go to you for advice on how to deal with what they think of as a retirement crisis. But there are some divergences here and what people think the solution should be. You think of Larry Fink, for example. BlackRock is now working to announce partnerships, initiatives over years to even work on the average age of retirement, encouraging people to work longer. You recently came out with a book debunking a lot of that thinking. What's the discrepancy here?
Well, if I was in a room with Larry Fink, I would say, look, what you do at BlackRock is a solution, that you're managing money, you're managing wealth for all Americans to save for their retirement. That's a really good thing to do, and Americans need to build more wealth for retirement. But if you think, Mr. Fink, that people working longer, maybe just 1 year or 2 years longer, will mean that people won't go into their old age without being downwardly mobile into poverty from being a middle-class worker, or you think that working longer will maintain people's living standards, you'll be wrong for 8 reasons. The first reason is that he and everyone else might think it just makes sense to work longer because people are living longer. And that's actually not true. Not everyone is living longer. There is a slice of the population that have had good health care, have had the kinds of jobs that enhance their health and their well-being and their skills, and they're living longer. So white men are definitely living longer than they had before. But there are some parts of our economy, of our America, where actually the longevity is going down. Deaths of despair, the suicides, the opioids, the addiction, even the kinds of jobs that people have are foreshortening their lives. So the inequality of longevity and healthy longevity is really disproportionately distributed, so they can't work longer. I have 6 others.
But let's harp on that for a moment, because a lot of people on Wall Street believe that working longer is a solution just because of how healthcare has gotten better. Let's get a little more specific on who it doesn't work for and how large is that population not being addressed if this is the solution?
Well, I've been in these rooms for about 40 years. That's how long my career has. And ever since I started, when Social Security was being cut and pensions were going on the wayside and there were more 401ks or do-it-yourself type systems, we all knew that people would not have enough given that we did not have a good pension system. And so people thought, well, for the small group of people who are blue-collar workers, bricklayers, they will be able to be disabled earlier. But for everybody else, the work is going to get easier. Well, in 40 years, that has not happened. Now think about it for a while. A lot of jobs that aren't blue-collar work have become pink-collar. And pink-collar jobs are jobs that women do, very much in the service sector, taking care of older people, taking care of children. That requires a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of stooping and bending, a lot of physical activity, and those jobs break bodies down. There are also a lot of light blue-collar jobs or semi-pink collar jobs that require a lot of engagement with the computer. And the computer has made some aspects of jobs easier on the knees, but the requirements for intense concentration, keen eyesight, and actually be able to speed up your work because of increased surveillance has actually made those jobs harder too. And when you add up all the complexities involved in jobs that older people have, those jobs actually can raise cortisol levels, increase inflammation, and cause more metabolic disorders and early death. So a lot of the jobs that people have or are expected to have in old age are actually the kinds of jobs that will break bodies down and are accelerating sickness.
That's the impact on the individual. It seems like the retirement burden in a lot of ways has shifted from employers to the individual. At the same time, there's a question of whether a lot of these jobs will be supported at that age level. How do you see that conundrum working out?
Yeah, well, there are some businesses that are hoping that there'll be a big supply of desperate older workers ready to work. Those jobs are in home health care and personal care. So we have one of the biggest industries, everybody, is in this personal care. They're destined to add over 1 million jobs in an economy where we'll only add about 11 million jobs over the past 10 years. A good 10% of the new labor force will be these jobs in just that one occupation. But business services, janitorial work, again, disproportionate amount of older workers. I think those businesses really like the fact that these workers are very, very cheap. And they're very desperate. The fact that jobs are breaking down their bodies really isn't of a concern of the employers. But part of the crisis is that the lucky ones will be able to get those jobs. The part of the crisis that I think that many experts, including Larry Fink, doesn't understand is that most people cannot decide when they retire. They are retired. They don't retire. The verb and the agent is really on the wrong person. So 52% of people who say they are retired said they were forced to retire, either because of their knees or their metabolic disorders or just the stress of the job they couldn't take, or they had to take care of their spouse, but also because they were pushed out or laid off. So this idea that workers can just decide to work longer is also a myth, because most people cannot decide whether or not to work or not.
There's another problem here, whether you're on a state or local pension plan here. Pensions across the entire country are underfunded.
Yes.
There's a separate issue as well with the 401k plans, where a lot of people are not saving enough to retire on.
Right.
Whose responsibility ultimately is it to make sure that there's enough money for this population to retire on?
We can say that it's up to the 18-year-old. To be financially literate and to understand that when they get out of school or start work, because half of 18-year-olds don't even try college. It's not an appropriate place for them. You can think, so it could be on the individual. And then people say, well, it's up to their parents to tell them what to do. Well, a lot of children did not pick the right parents. That was a joke. But it's really important for us as a society to realize that there's a lot of wealth, including knowledge and wealth, actual wealth that's handed down, and a lot of debt and a lot of burden that is also handed down. So the answer to your very pointed question, whose responsibility is, I'm going to say it is unreasonable to think that it's just the person, individual person's responsibility. No other country requires the individual to do so much for their retirement planning than the United States. So when we moved away from traditional pension plans, where if a worker worked, they were just put into a plan, that money was managed for them, they couldn't choose, and we moved to 401ks, where the worker had to decide how much to invest, whether or not to invest, and had to choose an employer that actually provided the plan. Most employers do not. Most people now, 83 million workers right now today as we're talking, are employed, but they're not employed in any kind of setup where they can save for work. So the employer doesn't even have to have any responsibility for it. And the government's responsibility is to give a tax deduction to an employee that happens to save. Well, who are those? They're the highest paid. And they have the sort of the best employers. So the tax deduction, the government's responsibility for savings, is only going for the very top, so that 80% of our $270 billion we spend, the government spends on retirement savings, is going, 80% of that is going to the top 20%.
Is that a call to eliminate the tax deduction with the 401k?
Yes, my colleague Alicia Manel and her Republican counterpart came together to call out what I'm calling out. So we're in agreement there. This is a very expensive and regressive tax, but it does help some people save for retirement. So why get rid of something where if it works for one slice of the population, all I'm saying is don't leave the 83 million people who don't have access to retirement plans out of this big bonanza. So perhaps we can put a cap on it and make it less expensive and more efficient by not giving away thousands of dollars a year to people who don't need it. So we could cap it, but we also could broaden it so that everybody can get some help from the government. I'm still going back to your question, whose responsibility is it? And it is the system's responsibility to get people to accumulate money for their retirement earlier in life. They accumulate Social Security credits. You know, there's no choice about whether or not you're in Social Security or not. Even the most conservative Republican would not call for making Social Security voluntary. So why do we have our pension system, the other vital part of the pension system, accumulating money, having it managed by BlackRock or whoever? Why would we make that voluntary? And the countries around the world that have a system that's graded A or A minus, there's an international grading system of pension systems, none of their advance funded, pre-funded part of their pension system is voluntary.
This idea of voluntary Social Security, there are real concerns under the surface on how to fund Social Security for the long term. A lot of concern outside of the baby boomer generation on how America's money gets filtered into America's youth as they age. What's the fix?
Yeah, so the fix for Social Security is to put more revenue in it. We are past the point where we can fix Social Security by cutting benefits. That is a non-starter because the benefits for Social Security are keeping almost all of the people on Social Security above the poverty level, everybody below a certain amount. So it is a vital anti-poverty device. Cutting it would just make the system even more grim. So we need more revenue into it. The Social Security actuaries back in the day, I mean, this is in the 30s, again renewed in the 40s, 50s, 60s, said that Social Security will need revenue from general revenues. We should not just be dependent upon the payroll tax to fund the whole thing. So there are many easy fixes to Social Security, and it really requires just more money from other pots, capital gains, lots of other places we can get Social Security revenue. The key thing as an economist is whether or not the amount of money needed will break the bank, will break the economy, and we're nowhere near that. We spend much less in terms of our GDP on the elderly than other countries. Even if we fully funded Social Security, we would still be under the international averages. It's less than 0.5% of GDP.
It's interesting to hear you say that capital gains can help fund Social Security. How much would that help fill the gap? And also, wouldn't that be a transfer of wealth from the investor class to the broader public?
Well, the investor class is part of the broader public. And part of the conversation we've been having for the past 5 years is that if you only try to protect the investor class and let them be involved in the wealth accumulating part of our economy, the investor class may be threatened by the collapse of the very economy they're benefiting from. So I think with Ray Dalio and even Larry Fink, there's very much a recognition from the investor class. I was just at the Milken conference that if we have a wealth building institutions in this country, everybody has to be part of it. So back to Social Security, I did a calculation that if Elon Musk paid for Social Security just on his salary for the entire year, and some of his capital gains were taxed to fund Social Security, just one person, it would save 1/20th of the deficit in Social Security. Imagine broadening that out to maybe 20,000 other people to gently, this is not very much, you don't have to raise the tax rate to any perceptible amount, but just helping share in the funding of Social Security, we could solve that problem overnight. The problem with not funding Social Security and not having an actuarial report to say, hey, it's funded for the next 25 years, is that it depresses the savings rates of ordinary Americans. We're finding out in surveys that people are saying, I'm not saving for retirement. I'm not building wealth because Social Security won't be there. The worst cultural norm that you could flame that would reduce the savings rate is fatalism. And not dealing with Social Security is inducing a fatalism that is suppressing the savings rate, which actually suppresses the motive for people to save for their own retirement. So it's interconnected.
So the fix for those 83 million people, as you're talking about, is Social Security part of that fix, or is it something else?
It's Social Security has to be part of it, but there has to be something else, which is much bolder than the kind of moving the needle legislation we've seen in the last 40 years. And almost everybody I talk to agrees, from the very highest investor class to the person who just did my makeup this morning, is that we need to get people saving for their life cycle needs, their retirement, as early as possible. So as soon as someone starts working and having to pay into Social Security is exactly the moment they should start paying into their own account. And there is a bill in Congress, not even just in the House or just in the Senate, but both in the House and in the Senate, and not supported by just Republicans or Democrats, but supported by both Republicans and Democrats. So it's a bipartisan, bicameral, simple fix, and that's called the Retirement Savings for Americans Act, RSAA. And what it does is everybody who's not in a pension plan now, so all of your listeners who are in the business and selling 401ks to companies, this does not apply to them. It only applies to all the people, about over half of workers who do not have a retirement account now and won't next year, that they will be automatically enrolled into a government-administered pension plan, a national pension plan. Automatically, they'll save 3%. And if their earnings are below the median, so that's half of workers in this eligible set, the government will match 5%. And everything we know from behavioral finance, from just case studies, is that when you include a match, something flips in people's brain. They're not fatalistic about retirement anymore.
It's interesting. This sounds very close to what we see in some other countries, similar to something like a super fund or even a sovereign wealth fund of its own kind for America. That kind of idea is something that you and a lot of the folks that are running these big financial institutions would agree on. Why would that be the fix? How hard is that to accomplish? Who manages the money?
Yeah, I've been working for a lot of years with many different people, many of them on Wall Street. I co-authored a book with Tony James, who was the president of Blackstone at the time. This was the fix. I wrote a paper with Kevin Hassett, who is Trump's top economic advisor. We all agree that we should take examples from other countries where they build a capital fund. Capitalists love it because it provides a capitalist fund and everybody's involved. And the Democrats love it, because it actually provides economic security. Republicans should care about economic security as well, but there's something for everybody. It is like a sovereign wealth fund, which is it's an asset that matches a liability, and that liability is that a population ages and can't work forever.
So one big problem that a lot of Americans have is getting them, as you've been saying, to save early on.
Yeah.
Many people are living paycheck to paycheck, in which they find it difficult to save.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, Sonali. We are finding, in fact, in practice and in surveys, that the lowest paid workers are the ones that want to save the most. They're not financially illiterate. It's actually the opposite. They're keenly aware of the hardships that they're facing, and they know that having a wealth cushion is really important. I've interviewed Latino mothers in Chicago and Los Angeles as part of a project that did that. And they said to us, give me a pension plan that's my own and that my family does not have access to. Because if I tried to save anything for my retirement, I have to use it for my family members. That's very much part of what wealth building is for different communities. So if we don't have a place where people can save for emergencies and also have it protected for their life cycle, no one, not except the elites, will be able to take advantage of compound interest.
The question of who manages the money in a fund like this, I think, is an important one because, I think the money management industry wakes up every day to try to meet these retirement needs. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, are they meeting that need?
The retail managers have a very different platform than the institutional managers. I'm a big fan of traditional pension plans, the ones that state and local workers have, and many of the unionized workers in big companies, or the companies that don't want to be unionized, so they provide a good plan, like the non-union car companies. What they do is they pool money. And this is what the government plan would do. The government would not manage this money. It would be managed just like the defined benefit plans of actually the World Bank, or the state of California. They would be managed by institutional investors, but more importantly, that the dollars invested into those kinds of pooled, professionally managed funds will go a lot further than the 401k money today. Right now, we provided a system to American workers that is guaranteed to not give them the best fee-adjusted, risk-adjusted rate of return, because the poor individual has to decide what portfolio to get them on the efficient frontier. Completely impossible for a worker who has to deal with building a building or teaching an English class, can possibly do. So we have a system that is not aligned with the capabilities of the people that have the most responsibility. So the money would be funded in the sovereign wealth fund by professional private money managers.
So there was a recent story in the New York Times with the question, was the 401k a mistake? It cites your research. Was the 401k a mistake?
Yes, the 401k system was a mistake. If it was meant to be the retirement system for all Americans, it would have been called the Retirement System for All Americans. Instead, it was named after an obscure part of the IRS code, and it was meant for a completely different purpose. It was meant to supplement Social Security and traditional pensions, but because of several factors, it became a retirement savings plan for just a privileged part of the American economy.
This idea of a pooled retirement plan, a giant super fund, let's call it the super fund for the sake of this conversation.
I like this.
In Australia, this is kind of one of the closest examples that there is. Even that's underfunded. So why would this be the right fix?
You always have a growing liability in any kind of pooled fund. And you saw that with Social Security. It's always had a drop-dead date of 20 years, but it's lasted for 75 years. There are many funds that aren't underfunded. And in fact, those good funds are funded because the money always comes in. In this super fund, that would be created, it would be always 100% funded because no money could come out that wasn't put in. The magic is that the money going in would be invested well, and it's not invested well in a 401k. So this idea is a hybrid fund between a defined contribution, defined benefit, but this fund would always be 100% funded.
So in the world of money management, there's a large and growing debate about the role of private assets. This whole idea that private assets, given that there is some room to wait to pay out some of the pensioners or retirees, that these private pools of capital can be used to increase yields in the interim.
Yeah.
Or even some say that there's a liquidity myth that exists in public markets versus private markets. But we are at a point where you're seeing pensions asking private fund managers for their money back. They're having trouble getting it back in many instances as well. Why would private assets be any sort of fix?
Yeah, no, I get that. It's not a fix for an individual fund. An individual having private assets along with liquid assets in a 401k account is very difficult to manage for exactly the reason you want. 401ks are not long-term investments. They're fully liquid. A person can take money out of that account. Remember my Latino mothers? And so Congress called them retirement accounts, but they're not retirement accounts at all. I told Congress, I think just several weeks ago, I was in front of a Senate committee. I said, Congress, call them the Great American Emergency Savings Act, our savings accounts, but have a real retirement account. A real retirement account is not liquid, and therefore the asset that is not as liquid as a public market assets is the appropriate asset. So you get this. We have this system where we're trying to match short-term assets with long-term liabilities. It's a huge, giant asset mismatch that is costing Americans their old age, and it's costing the American economy a huge inefficiency. So a super fund would be an asset that has long-term illiquid liabilities as well as others, but it would match this long-term liability each worker has, which is their life cycle needs.
So to be clear, you think private assets make sense in a longer-term pooled portfolio, but not in a 401k plan?
Yeah, and I know I'm up against some of my friends that are trying to sell them, maybe little itsy-bitsy parts in an account, but no, because the 401k is a liquid account. And even the private asset managers will say, yeah, it's not for someone who demands liquidity. And what I'm telling them is that every 401k holder will demand liquidity because the leakage in these plans, are gigantic. It's dooming the system to be a retirement plan, and therefore it's not a good asset.